So what would you say to the people who advocate for genetic engineering, who say, we just, this is one of those areas where we just need to let the science speak for itself, and if we could get all of the politics and the sociology and sort of ideology of production methods out of the way, that and just look at the pure science here, that we've got a winning agenda.
Well, there are, in order to understand science, it's necessary to understand it from several different angles. One of them is what goes into the science. So, science is always, it is funded, for example. There are questions of who's allowed to do what research. There are questions of the institutional biases. We set up institutes to fund to research certain subjects and not to research certain other subjects. Why do we do that? Right? Science is not a neutral thing that just appears. It's like free speech is the same, right? You have to have a platform, you have to have the mindset, you have to have the resources to draw on, you have to have a high circulation magazine, and the same thing is true in science. We have all these issues of, for example, why does some research appear in prestigious journals and other research appears in journals that hardly anyone reads, right? There's not a free market of information, and sometimes the reason why this research appears in well-read or well-respected or widely read or well-funded journals has to do with very political reasons and not to do with the quality of the research. And quality of the research is inherently is a judgmental concept, right, in and of itself. The whole idea that in science we have good journals and not so good journals is a judgment that we often hide from ourselves or hide from the public. But all scientists judge good and bad research, but everyone, if you ask them in private what their criteria are for that good and bad quality, they will probably tell you different things, and so there are all these judgments that go into science that are not being explicit in that ideology of we just let the science speak for itself. And then there's also the ideology of science in the sense that science doesn't speak for itself. You have to also understand the context in which that science is being listened to, and so so people have all sorts of interpretations that they lay onto that science that creates positive and negative feedbacks for the environment in which that science happens. So, for example, I was reading a paper in Science the other day, Science magazine, which is a prestigious scientific journal, and it's about where the bee populations are suffering from climate change. And basically they do some research, and they look at bees disappearing from northerly or failing to accumulate in northerly areas and disappearing from the southerly areas of their ranges in the northern hemisphere. So it's as if the bee population is moving according to climate change, but the incorporation of issues like, for example, whether those bee populations are being affected by pesticide use, it's not properly incorporated into that data. Okay, so so you have this headline paper about bees being affected by climate change, that for which the conclusion is not very well supported by the data. But the researchers think that they have really good quality on pesticide use, but I happen to know that the pesticide use data collected by the agencies in the countries that they're talking about is not actually of high quality. And so you've got all these judgments that are going into a conclusion that bees are being affected by climate change, and yet in the same week I was looking at a paper published in an obscure journal of insect biology, showing that these researchers could reproduce colony collapse disorder by merely applying a pesticide. And they used two different pesticides, so they could carry on this research. And they could show from two different perspectives, i.e. they put on one neonicotinoid, or they could apply another neonicotinoid. And in both cases, they could reproduce colony collapse disorder. And both the papers are trying to explain the disappearance of bees. And one is a high-profile journal postulating something to do with climate change based on some very flimsy information. Another one is a pretty much ironclad description of what happens in colony collapse disorder, and yet showing that pesticides are involved in that, and yet it's published in an obscure journal with no press release and with no media coverage consequent to that. So you do have to look at the when somebody just says science just speaks, well, that depends on the context in which that science happens.